Hello, this is an introduction to epidemiology and disease transmission. Epidemiology is defined as the study of patterns of health, disease, and injury in human populations and the application of this study to the control of health problems. The word epidemiology comes from three Greek words. The first, epi, meaning on, upon, or befall, the root term demos, referring to for the people, and the suffix term logos, referring to the study of. Together, these terms mean the study of that which befalls people. Now, the primary function of epidemiology is to summarize the distribution of disease and to identify determinants or causes of health-related states or events. By cause, we're referring to some specific event or condition or a characteristic that comes before an outcome and that is necessary. And in this course and in epidemiology, we often refer to those causes as risk factors. These include behavioral, environmental, or some inherent human characteristic that we find that to be associated with the health condition. Now, in epidemiology, there are two fundamental approaches. The first is descriptive, and this is essentially the characterization of the distribution of health-related states or events in a population. And then the second approach is analytic in nature, and this refers to finding and quantifying associations, testing hypotheses regarding those associations, and identifying health-related states or events. In this class, we will spend the majority of our time focused on the analytical approaches in epidemiology. Now, there are some underlying assumptions whenever we explore the association between a risk factor and an outcome. First and foremost, we're interested in we assume that illness and disease are not randomly distributed in human populations. We also assume that each human being has characteristics that can either predispose them toward a specific illness or protect them from it. And similarly, we assume that communities and neighborhoods also have characteristics that predispose them toward or against an illness. And then finally, that these characteristics that we're studying are identifiable and modifiable. Without both, then it's difficult to determine causal associations and then to act on them. Now, in epidemiology, we're often referred to as medical detectives, and as such, we're focused in on the who, the what, the where, the when, the how, why, and the how with regards to a particular disease or problem. And in the following lecture on outbreak investigation, we will discuss these in greater detail. Now, there are 5 key objectives in epidemiology. The first is to identify the cause of a disease and the risk factors for that specific disease. For example, we may be interested in how is the disease or condition being transmitted or acquired. We also may be interested in how different subgroups in a population, perhaps by race or sex or age or another factor, are at a higher risk or lower risk for acquiring a specific disease than others. There are a myriad of questions we could be asking in this particular objective. The second objective is then to determine the extent of that disease within the population or community of interest. This generally falls under the guise of surveillance, but it's a very important one because we're generally interested in the overall burden or distribution of a disease or a condition. The third objective is to study the natural history and prognosis of a disease. This is where we're interested in the morbidity and mortality associated with a specific disease and how those factors have changed or may change over time. So, for instance, the HIV/AIDS epidemic that occurred in the 1980s had a different morbidity and mortality than it has today, and that's due to the availability of treatment for people infected with HIV, as well as the changing of the virus itself. And a fourth objective in epidemiology is then to evaluate existing and new preventive and therapeutic approaches, as well as modes of healthcare delivery for dealing with a particular disease problem. So, for example, we may be interested in whether or not screening for a specific disease has any meaningful impact on the population. And then the final objective is to provide the foundation for developing public health policy and regulatory decisions. This is a broad objective, and we will discuss this in a later lecture. So there are two key areas of study in epidemiology, observational and experimental. The key difference between the two is in experimental epidemiology, the researcher is intervening on the subjects of interest, whereas in observational epidemiology, there is no intervention, and instead the researcher is merely observing the individuals or subjects of a population. This slide provides you a listing of some key fields of epidemiology, and as you can see, epidemiology has application in a myriad of fields, including nutrition, cancer, infectious diseases, as well as in environmental research. And in more recent, in the last few decades, computational epidemiology has become a field, and this is focused in on using computational tools to look at large levels of data for purposes of epidemiologic investigation.